Good Monday evening. It is March 13th. You are listening to The Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. And tonight, because we missed a great show last night, and I only say that because it's always a great show, but my friend and partner in crime, Nick Vandergraat, co-host of The Nick and Joe Show on Sunday nights, unfortunately was traveling. He's been spending a little bit of time out on Canada's west coast, and so we were talking this afternoon. I said, Nick, we missed our show last night. Let's get together and do a show together tonight. So Nick is joining us from sunny Sioux Lookout, Ontario.
I am back.
There he is.
Excuse me.
Nick Vandergraat with his gravelly voice, spending
Well-
too much time on commercial airliners.
Oh, good Lord. Joseph?
Hey, I got to ask you, before you go into that, Nick, I just got to ask this one very important question.
Okay.
Have you gotten COVID yet from being, caught up in those flying tubes with people that apparently are infected with COVID?
Oh, of course. That was they when you walk through security, they stamp it right on your forehead. You are going to get COVID. Do not mount the plane till you get COVID. So, no, I didn't get COVID.
I had to ask that question because
Yeah.
I was at a place this afternoon where they were still talking about it, but they were talking about it from the other side of the coin. They were saying, oh, those COVID police, and they were trying to shut us down all the time, et cetera, et cetera. So it was just on top of my mind. Anyway, I cut you off there, Nick.
I was just going to share just a little bit about our latest adventure out to the West Coast. We were supposed to be in Winnipeg Thursday morning for like 5:30 in the morning to fly out to Victoria, and we left here with plenty of time. For us, it's about a 4.5 or 5 hour drive to Winnipeg from here. So we get down between Dryden and Kenora. The Trans-Canada narrows down to 2 lanes, and there is no alternative. If you don't make it through on that road, you don't make it through at all. And when you know it, there was an accident ahead of us. And we sat in that traffic for 9 hours. There was just nowhere to go. So we missed our flight. Okay. We have to pay some more money because now we have to, they allowed us to use the credit we already had, but because we're now booking a new ticket with no lead at all, you're paying premium for that ticket. So there was an increase in the price. All right, fine. We get on the airplane, fly to Vancouver, get on the puddle jumper to fly to Victoria, delayed. A few minutes later, delayed again. A few minutes later, delayed again. We were conscious. We were awake for 31 hours by the time we finally hit our Airbnb and flopped onto the bed. It was, oh, what an adventure. The return trip went absolutely smooth as silk. Everything was right on time. Everything was great. But of course, now it doesn't matter. You're coming home. But that trip out, I'm telling you what, we were zombies by the time we got to the Airbnb, and we stayed in a really great place in a little town called Sauk Harbor. And if anybody Sauk Harbor, if anybody ever travels southern end of Vancouver Island, dash me off a note. Let me know. I've got a couple places you can stay that are really nice. The one we stayed in was almost like a little cabin right on the ocean. And it was just gorgeous. Nice place, wasn't overly expensive, and we really had a great trip. But boy, I'll tell you, that trip out there was not for the faint of heart.
What was the weather like while you were out there?
We had a couple days of sunshine. A lot of times it would start out bright and sunny in the morning, or no, raining in the morning, and then brighten up in the afternoon. Yesterday it rained all day. But I didn't care because it was like 45 degrees out, and I knew I was going to Winnipeg. They don't call it winter peg for nothing. It was minus 25. The truck wouldn't start. I had to get a booster pack from the guys inside the Winnipeg airport. Big difference in temperature. And everybody says, Vancouver and Victoria, they're so depressing because it's always raining. You don't got to shovel the rain. Keep that in mind. So if you're complaining about it, and you live in central or eastern Canada, you got nothing to complain about, or at least that in mind. Complain by going to Vancouver. Enjoy the weather because it's a lot nicer where you just came from in the wintertime.
Ain't that the truth? Of course, it's been pretty
Yes.
warm here in Ottawa, so which is Canada's capital, but hovering around the freezing mark. So a few degrees below zero,
Yeah.
below freezing at night, a few degrees above freezing during the daytime. So typical March weather. Anyway, listen, I gotta just before we jump into the first topic that I wanted to get into tonight, Nick, I have to take the occasion just to say to make a observe that March 13th was my mother's birthday. Of course, my mother has passed many years ago now. But I just felt that I wanted to do her the courtesy and respect of observing the fact that even though she's not with us anymore physically, she certainly is with us in spirit. Believe me, every time I do something or I'm thinking about doing something off color or a little off track, I could still hear my mother
Now, Joseph.
picking up one of those logs that used to go into the wood stove
Ouch.
and saying, I can throw this faster than you can run away.
And you know what? She probably could.
She probably could. And in fairness now, I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression because she never actually threw any of those logs at us.
She didn't have to. The threat of doing it was enough.
No, no, no. My mother was a tough cookie. Let me tell you, she didn't stand for nonsense from anybody. Anyway,
And
there it
everybody knew
is,
it too.
and everybody knew it.
There you go.
Well, I grew up still in one of those neighborhoods and one of those places where if you did something and somebody saw you, it was sort of like, I can call your parents. Parents don't do that today. Parents don't. Adults don't police the kids anymore, and frankly, because they probably would get into a lot of trouble if they were doing it, and parents don't want anybody calling and saying that their kids were doing anything, and so I'll give Hillary Clinton this much credit. It really does take a village to and maybe it shouldn't, but the growing up in a community that everybody knew everybody else that lived within a couple of miles of one another, you just couldn't get away with anything, nor would we want
Nope.
to anyway.
Well, I know I certainly did want to a bunch of times, but you know the old saying about living in a small town. The beauty of living in a small town is everybody knows who you are. The worst part about living in a small town is everybody knows who you are.
Yeah, exactly. You are not wrong, my friend.
That's right. If it was good, you were okay. But if it was bad, your dad knew about it long before you got home.
So
And that's who I
listen,
was more worried about than my mother.
my father was a tough guy also, but when it came to the kids and that he wasn't that tough on us. He was a bit of a pushover. Nah, no, that's not fair. He marshmallow, let's just say, it wasn't a pushover, but I'll tell you. Let me just say this about
Big
we didn't.
softy.
I had this is an example, ladies and gentlemen, of how when Nick and I do our show, which is on Sunday nights now. I'm going to say that repeatedly throughout today. We always have these subjects we want to talk about, and then we end up going totally off topic and talking about
We
something
call
else.
it kibitzing.
Kibitzing.
Or kibitzing? Is that
Listen, I have
exist?
to let me just say this. My father was unfortunately the Second World War, interrupted his schooling.
Right.
And so my father only had like a grade 4, maybe 5 education. And he was one of the smartest people I knew. Spoke 5 languages, and just the common sense in this guy, and his dedication to pausing and thinking about something before he did it, and insisting that other people actually think about what they're doing as they're doing it or before. It was just, I'm not just saying this because he was my father. I mean, this guy was just an incredibly smart, common sense person. And he came to this country, settled down, started up a business, a successful business, raised a family on his own income. And it's,
Well,
you
that
don't hear
seems
a lot about that these days, especially from people who were, born in Canada, we'll call them, typical Canadians as opposed to immigrants.
It seems to be a hallmark of that generation because my dad, I don't know that he finished grade school. I think he probably finished grade 8, but that was about it for the same reason because World War II came along and Holland was a mess. And he was, I won't say he was the smartest man I've ever met. He was incredibly wise, but he was probably one of the hardest working men I've ever met. To try to keep up with him was virtually impossible. The man could work like mad and it used to drive me crazy because he'd expect me to try to keep up with him. Anyway, I won't go into my childhood, but just to say, to agree with you that I think that people of that generation seem to be overly endowed with common sense and things that we struggle with just made perfect sense to them. So if that's, I have a feeling your father and my dad were cut from the same cloth, maybe from two different corners of the world, but it's that ability to think on your feet, to react to changing situations, take advantage of the opportunities as they're presented. And a lot of that's been lost today. Everybody's so specialized in what they do. The idea of having a general set of skills that serve you well is not very common anymore.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. People are too specialized, I think. But the other thing is, my father and I guess your father as well, and I have to say my mother as well. My mother grew up in not very pleasant, very circumstances either. My parents were people who learned very early on that they had to look after themselves, and that's what they did. But looking after themselves, not in a selfish way, just being responsible, not passing the buck, not looking for other people to do things for them. And I don't know, maybe that's part of the whole.
Well, there was no government program to help them out. They had to figure it out on their own.
Yeah, well, not just no government program. I mean, the fact is that, well, especially in my father's case, there was actually no government to rely on anyway, period. So,
true.
From a very young age, he had to fend for himself. And, he lost his parents very early, and he spent the war years doing a lot of wandering around and really literally, as a young teenager, having to fend for himself. And, it's a terrible situation to grow up in. But the skill set that he acquired by living and working and surviving in that kind of an environment, frankly, served him very well. And, there was a thing that he didn't explicitly teach me, but that I've heard verbalized at several occasions, and that I've, been telling my own kids and grandchildren now who, they rush into things without thinking, and they get themselves in all kinds of messes and have to clean up and things like that. And I tell them, sometimes the best way to speed things up is to slow down.
Amen to that. The hurrier I go, the behinder I get.
That's absolutely it, exactly.
Yep.
Okay, Nick, we've burned through our first 15 minutes. When we get back, ladies and gentlemen, because we do have some serious stuff to talk about, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on down in the States, and particularly Fox News, Tucker Carlson, and some of the reporting that's being done down there, not just about what's happening in America, but also about what's happening here in Canada. So stick with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in 2 minutes, or a little bit more than 2 minutes, here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show.
Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. Give me ice cream with whipped cream. Ice cream. A million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's chocolate taste, high school vanilla for me. Hundreds and thousands. I need an ice cream island. Give me ice cream with whipped cream, strawberry sauce, and see my face gleam. I need a wafer on top, just ice cream full stop. So take me to the pudding shop. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. Ice cream, a million flavors, let's just do it. Tie me up with ice cream. Sunny days need that cold hit. That strawberry chocolate taste.
There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look, I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look, I think this might.
And we are back. I am Joseph Ben-Ami. You are listening to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And with me tonight is my very good friend and partner in crime from the Nick and Joe Show, Nick Vandergrat.
That would be me.
That would be
Me.
him.
Yes.
Okay, let's
would
not
be me.
waste any time kibitzing. We did that for the first 15 minutes of the show.
And no kibitzing either.
No kibitzing or kibitzing.
Right. Put the
Okay,
emphasis on the right syllable.
we are trying.
All right. There you go.
So, Nick, I like Tucker Carlson.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that in terms of world outlook, I agree with him. Probably, I don't want to say on everything because obviously I don't know the man personally, so I can't say whether I actually agree with him on everything that he thinks. But certainly everything that I have seen from him, heard from him, I have to say I agree with.
Yeah, I
I
think
like
that's
the man. I think he does a great job. He's got a good show. And recently, he has been dissecting the surveillance video from the January 6th, 2021 riots at the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C.
right.
And the case that he's been making has been that, this was not an insurrection. Of course, I'd agreed with that right from the word go. Yeah,
Right.
an insurrection takes a little bit more organization than what you saw. So clearly there was violence. Clearly there was a riot, but, an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States, I mean, that was just delusional. So just on its surface, that claim that it was an insurrection or an attempt to overthrow the government was just ridiculous. So, when he was talking about this, and he has been for 2 years, off and on, that's the position he took, and I agree with it. And then he's been showing excerpts of the videotape surveillance from that particular day and talking about, you see, this is what I've been saying all along. Look, it looks peaceful here, it's there. And I tend to agree with him. I think the video that he's shown backs that up. And I'm sure he cherry-picked to a certain degree. Maybe not, but, I would be surprised if he didn't. That's what journalists do. But even with the cherry-picking, it's hard for me to think that he could really give a false impression by cherry-picking video, okay? Because, especially since he was also saying, yeah, there was violence, and I don't condone the violence. And he showed some video of violence, but he also showed video to back up his claims that it wasn't such a bad situation. Okay, so anyway, I'm watching this stuff, and I'm agreeing with him. But then the next day or 2 days after he does this, he has this teenager on the show, and I'm watching and I'm listening. I'm going, uh-oh, I know about this particular thing that he's talking about. I know about it from not personally, but as close to personal as you can be without actually being there. Okay. So I know some of the details around this situation. I'm talking here about this fellow that was allegedly arrested in Renfrew, Ontario, as a high school student, a Catholic school, for apparently or allegedly claiming that there was only two genders. And I watched this, and he had this fellow on, and he had this fellow's lawyer on, who I also, as it happens, know. And I thought to myself, this is wrong. And the lead in to that segment on his show, Nick, he was making this claim that, Canada's a totalitarian country. You can't even say that it's only two genders without the risking being arrested and thrown in jail. And I thought, again, not only was he wrong in the way that he portrayed the facts in this, and I give him the benefit of a doubt here. I mean, I'm not saying he's purposely misleading anyone. He doesn't know. He's only going by what he was told. And of course, when he interviewed the alleged victim here and the lawyer, they presented their side of the argument, and nobody presented the other side of the argument. And I thought to myself, Tucker, I love you. I love what you're doing. I think it's great that there's somebody out there who's not afraid. But it just was another indication of how you just can't trust what you're seeing on the internet. And just as important, you can't trust what you're getting on the mainstream news. And it bothered me, Nick, and I'm interested in your take on this, because I know you have some fairly close knowledge about this as well, this particular case. Mm-hmm. But it just bothers me so much that not only that here's an American commentator making accusations that Canada is a totalitarian country, and I'm not trying to excuse anything that our government does. I think that our government has gone way over the edge, and I think that they do certain things that are leaning towards totalitarianism, okay? And we talk about this on our show, you and I, Nick, and
that's right,
I talked about it on my show, but we're not really a totalitarian country, Canada, okay? There are disturbing things that governments do, but we're not really totalitarian. So in the first place, it's upsetting me that Tucker Carlson is doing this, calling us this, and that Canadians themselves, commentators from the right of the ring of the political spectrum, where you and I are firmly planted with both feet, okay? But we have even people, our own friends and colleagues, that are talking this way. And then, but worse than that, to back it up with what we know is, I'm not going to say false information, but I'm going to say incomplete information, and as a consequence, giving a very wrong impression about what happened at that particular event.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me go back to the beginning where all this started. I know someone who is on the inside on this story, and I will not divulge them because I, first of all, don't have their permission to do that. And I don't think it matters. I don't think it's going to change the story. The fact is that this gentleman, this young man, had a very strong opinion and was on the verge of violence, proclaiming that. Now, look, I agree with him, and I'm sure you do too, that this whole gender neutral nonsense is exactly that. It's just plain nonsense. The trouble is when somebody goes off like this and they get themselves into trouble, because from what I understand and what I have been told by this very knowledgeable information, this particular school board bent over backwards to make sure they didn't suspend him for exactly these reasons, because they didn't want to sensationalize the case. And in this particular instance, I have to give the school board credit. They tried to take care of this in an adult and professional way, and it just was not going to happen. So when people do that, it makes it much harder for people like you and I to stand up and be taken as seriously as reasonable adults with an objection to something that's going on when this guy's in the background sounding off like a bullhorn. I won't go into all the gory details, but the way that he went about this was completely all wrong. And instead of being calm, cool, and collected and taking a page out of Jordan Peterson's book, like, he doesn't get upset. He just answers objections with facts. And if the young man in this case had done that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So, okay, so that's the background there. Let's talk about the mainstream media. And like you, I like Tucker Carlson. I think he's a man with integrity. I think he does the best job he can, given the circumstances under which he's working, which a lot of us have to work with today because of the culture that we're in. It's very difficult to call him as you see him anymore because of the backlash that comes. But even with all that said, what if he had done the same thing, just said, okay, let's just slow down. We'll do a little research. Because, Joseph, you and I sometimes will take a couple of weeks to get to a topic simply because we want to see where the dust settles. We want to see what's going on before we go shooting our mouths off. And even then, we don't always get it right, or at least I don't. You know, I've heard you rein me in a couple of times, say, well, hang on now. Let's not go running down that track too fast.
Well, Nick, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you because I have a question I have to ask you, because we're going to have to go for a break in a couple of minutes here, and we'll carry on the conversation on the other side. But what I'd like to give our listeners, is just a taste, without getting into a lot of detail, about what kind of things were going on that led to the school eventually asking this particular fellow to leave. And again, this is secondhand. We're only getting this from people who were apparently there or have firsthand knowledge. So, you know, I'm just saying that because who knows, maybe we're getting it wrong. But just what are the allegations here?
Okay, the allegations are that this young man not only was of a very strong opinion about this particular topic, he was standing on tables in the classroom yelling obscenities at anyone who disagreed with him and would not be reasonable. And the school board bent over backwards trying to get him to see reason. They wanted to respect his point of view, and he simply would not have it. And the longer it went, the worse it got. So the school board eventually had no choice but to evict him. Evict him is not the right word. Expel him. And it involved the police. And that's when the sensationalism took over.
So if I understand correctly, it wasn't just that he was expressing his opinion, but he was expressing it in such a way that was extremely disruptive and upsetting to other students.
Yes.
And that eventually the school basically said, okay, look, you're going to have to leave. And that's it. You have to leave. And he was suspended. And it's only after, once he was suspended, trying to get back onto the school property, that the school then felt that they had to call the police, and he was arrested for trespassing, not for expressing his opinion.
Exactly. That's exactly the way that went down.
See, that's not the way that it was portrayed on Tucker's show, and understandably, because it was the alleged perpetrator, if I could use that legal sort of jargon, that was making the case. And, you know, of course, he's going to make the case as for himself. He's going to put his point of view forward, and, you know, that's his right. But it just gave a very wrong impression, I felt, based on our previous discussions about this particular incident, what we knew about it, and what you in particular knew about it from your sources. It just appeared to me that you know, Tucker and his staff fell down on the job in that they didn't really follow up to make sure that they were getting the story straight. Nick, we're just going to go for a quick break. Let's carry on the conversation when we come back, okay?
Sure.
2 minutes and a little bit. Ladies and gentlemen, freshen your drinks, do whatever you have to do, and then rush back to your computer or however else you're catching us this evening on the Joseph Banamy Show. We'll be back in a minute. Okay, we are back. Thanks for sticking with us. You're listening to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami, and I am joined tonight by my good friend and colleague, Nick Vandergraat, who is in Sioux Lookout, and we usually do the Nick and Joe show together. And that used to be on Wednesday nights, but it's now moved to Sunday evenings for those of you who have been missing us. Anyway, we were going to do the show last night, but Nick was traveling and et cetera, et cetera. So we were not able to do our show last night. And I just thought, well, let's make up for it tonight by having Nick on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. So
you're
there he
glutton
is.
for punishment.
Here he is. Oh, it's not so bad. It's not so bad, Nick. Come on. So we were talking. So we've been talking about this incident in Renfrew, Ontario, with a Catholic high school student that was evicted from his school. If you believe Fox News and if you believe Tucker Carlson, and I can't believe it because I'm starting to sound like Chuck Schumer and CNN and
I think you're a long
Nancy
walk
Pelosi
away
and all
from-
these guys, and I don't want to. I feel terrible about it to a certain degree, but Tucker had the fellow on, and it gave the impression that he was evicted and arrested because he was defending the fact that there are only two genders, but that was not really the whole story, and it really kind of brought home in a very personal way, or as close to personal as you can get without actually being the actual people involved in the situation, that it brought home the fact that you just can't really trust the mainstream media, and that goes for whether you're talking the right wing or the left wing media, and it's frustrating because where do you get your information from? It used to be that the mainstream media was, they played it pretty straight for the most part. For the most part, they played it pretty straight. But now, if I turn on CNN, or even if I turn on Fox, or certainly if I turn on Newsmax or America First or any of those places, or and I'm speaking specifically of American media, Nick, it's, 50% or more of their content is bashing the other side, either bashing the left or bashing the right, depending on where you're broadcasting from, or even bashing directly your opposites in the other networks, your opposing networks, or your competing network is the word I was looking for.
Right.
And to me, there are a lot of people that are in the stands, so to speak. It's like a hockey game. I'm cheering for my team.
I don't care how bad they stink.
I don't care.
Canadians fan.
It's go get him, Tiger Williams.
Yeah, who hasn't played in 30 years, but that's a different story.
No.
You know what, though? I think part of what we have to keep in mind is how little most people, even some of the more sophisticated people from the States, know about this country. They, because let's face it, the Americans have a different point of view about these kind of issues. They're very, and I'm probably going to invent a phrase here, charter-centric or Bill of Rights-centric, far more than we are. And I've always admired them for that. But because their education system doesn't dwell on a lot of stuff outside of their own experience, you can almost forgive the ignorance. Now, in a case like Tucker Carlson or any of the major news outlets down there, they normally get some pretty fundamental stuff wrong about the country. And we've kind of grown used to that because we're the little brother. Somebody once said living next to Americans is like sleeping, a mouse sleeping with an elephant. The elephant may not notice, but the mouse knows every time the elephant moves. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. It's one of these cases where you got to ask yourself, all right, what does he really know? Like one of my favorite hosts down there is Greg Gutfeld. He's crass. He can be downright rude sometimes. He can be a jerk, but he's funny, and he's the hottest talk show host in the world right now. And he's been covering this story from Canada about the school teacher with these massive prosthetic breasts down there around London somewhere, and he's been following it called Bazumba Gate. They've been having some fun with it, but it's clear he doesn't really know much about Canadian culture. Not that that's necessarily bad, but it's just obvious. So
And it's just to be clear, Bazumba Gate is not a good indication or a good example of Canadian culture. Just wanted to make sure that we were
very
clear
good
about that.
point. Yes, we like to think we're a little more cultured than that, although you wouldn't know it based on some of the stuff coming out of Central Ontario. Anyway, so the point is that you have to be a little bit forgiving, is the right word, maybe, when it comes to our cousins to the south not knowing a lot about us. And when they do try to talk about our politics or our culture or anything to do with life north of the 49th parallel, uh, sometimes you're going to get it wrong because they don't understand the context. Just like you and I or a Canadian wouldn't understand really down to the fiber of your being the gun culture in the United States because we don't experience it. We only commented on it from afar. Now, I'm not making any excuses because Tucker and any news agency, CNN, MSNBC, these people aren't stupid. They're very biased. There's no doubt about it. I mean, and the one thing I like about Fox is they don't bother to try to hide their bias. So at least you know where it's coming from, even if you don't agree with it. There's always that. But when you have this going on, these major news outlets who have budgets in the millions of dollars can't pick up a phone and say, okay, what's really going on up there? Or send up a reporter and do a proper story. I mean, how hard is that? And
Well,
that's how come we end up with this mess.
And they sent reporters during the truck convoy, the demonstration here in 2022, in February of 2022. So, they have the budget, they know where we are. But you're right. Pick up the phone and call. And I guess it bothers me. It's not the left wing, right wing thing. It's the two things are, first of all, it's really hard, as I think you already mentioned, to try to defend a more conservative position when our own conservative colleagues in the mainstream media get it so wrong sometimes.
Yeah.
And you end up in a situation where, people like you and I, who are maybe not quite on the popularity level of a Tucker Carlson, end up coming on the air, Nick, and criticizing them not because we want to be critical of them and not because we are necessarily critical of them, although we are in this case, but really because I just think it's important that we set the record straight. The record has to be straight. Otherwise, what are we doing in this business?
If you don't do it, if you do not do it, if you don't at least try to be accurate, make the attempt, then your credibility goes out the window. It's hard enough to convince people that you're a trustworthy source of information that they can count on as it is. And then you have this kind of thing happen. Well, then you give all the opponents to your point of view. Oh, yeah, well, look, they really botched that, man. They have no idea. You're just feeding them ammunition. It's like carrying ammunition to the enemy and say, here, shoot us with this. That kind of stuff. So I understand what Tucker was trying to do. And he's a great champion of charter rights and the Bill of Rights and all that stuff and freedom. And I admire him for that. But you're right. He got it wrong this time.
The other thing I have to say, Nick, that bothers me, and it doesn't bother me so much to hear it from our friends down south of the border. It really bothers me to hear it here in Canada. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have problems in this country. Nobody's hiding them. If you're a regular listener to this show or to Nick and I on our show together, you know that we don't hide from any of these issues. We're not afraid to hit them head on. But we are not a dictatorship, okay? This is not the old Soviet Union where, we have gulags. We don't have concentration camps in this country. Nobody's being lined up and shot. So, you know, I think a little perspective is in order. And the reason I say this is not to diminish the concerns that I have, or certainly, you know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Nick, but the concerns that I think you share with me for the future of the country and the direction we seem to be going, the trends out there are troubling. But the real practical result of exaggerating from time to time how things are is that, to a very large extent, those claims undermine our ability to fight back, so to speak, in that
Yeah.
there are a lot of people out there who hear the exaggerated claims and turn us off, okay, or turn off the media that's talking this way, and we get caught up in that. Or, alternatively, people who are concerned simply go, we're too far gone, there's nothing we can do about it, and therefore they don't get engaged in the kind of activities that can stem the tide, that could turn things back in the right direction.
Yeah, you're quite right there too. All it does is make it harder for everybody. That's what you put it into a nutshell. Makes it harder for everybody, no matter what side. Especially if you're on, like in this young man's case, whether now it doesn't really matter whether I agree with him or not. He's done so much damage that he's like he's canceled. I hate to use the phrase, but he's canceled himself. Now he can't go out and speak effectively because as soon as he does, people go, "Oh yeah, that's that hot-headed kid that got tossed out of school. He went on national TV. He went on down the states and was on the Fox News, and all of a sudden his credibility is shredded when he could have been a real force for change and somebody worth listening to."
Okay, we're going to have to go for our final break of the hour. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about claims to Indigenous ancestry and how the mainstream media and everybody now is starting to investigate these claims and the ramifications when we get back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. Thanks for sticking with us. You're listening to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. And we are joined tonight by my friend and colleague, even though he's halfway across the country these days, Nick Vandergrat, all the way up in Sioux Lookout, Ontario, and soon to be all the way in Vancouver Island, on Vancouver Island. I wanted to say in Vancouver, and then I thought, no, that's not right.
No, it's not.
No, of course it's not.
No, no, no.
You wouldn't
Anyway,
do that.
yeah. Well, someday I'll tell the story of that whole adventure, but I don't want to get into it now.
No.
But because we only have about 10 minutes left to show, and it'll waste time talking about that. We've got more important issues like people who claim, you know what? Elizabeth Warren in the States did this. When did she do this? A few years ago. Claimed that she was Mohawk or something like that, only to find out she doesn't have a drop of native blood in her veins. And it's just, now there's a trend. There's even a trend now in the States where people are beginning to claim to be different races, not just different genders. One woman went and had surgery to make herself look like she was Korean. Now, she's a white Caucasian from, I don't know, Boston someplace, who knows? But the point is, where do you draw the line with this stuff?
Well, the genesis of this particular discussion for our listeners is the most recent decision now by Memorial University, sorry about that, to investigate their president's claim to have Indigenous ancestry. Vivian Timmins apparently is taking a voluntary 6-week paid leave of absence. Thank you very much to the taxpayers of Newfoundland and Labrador for continuing to pay, at least partially, President Vivian Timmins' salary while she is being investigated.
Must be nice.
And it's really strange, actually, because, when I was following the story, she's saying that she's never made a claim to be a Mi'kmaq Indian or have Mi'kmaq Indigenous background. So I'm not really sure how this all got started, but it's an interesting topic, and it follows very soon on the heels of the revocation of honorary degrees that had been granted to Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, who is the British Columbia representative for child and youth. So she works for the government in British Columbia, and she has claimed in the past apparently to be a treaty Indian, a status Indian here in Canada. She made the claim allegedly to be the first treaty Indian apparently appointed to be a provincial court judge in Saskatchewan when she was doing that, claiming her father was a Cree. And apparently that was, a whole thing was concocted. And since then, they've been withdrawing all of these honorary degrees that were granted to her, which raises the question, and I know this is a digression, I don't want to get into this, but it just raises the question of how, why were they granting her honorary degrees in the first place? Because of her accomplishments? I mean, what's the great accomplishment of being a provincial court judge in Saskatchewan? I mean, it has a value in and of itself, don't get me wrong, but just because she was allegedly at that time anyway claiming to be of Cree ancestry, was it a special accomplishment that somebody who happens to be Cree, and it turns out she wasn't, but she wasn't Cree, so therefore it's not a special accomplishment after all. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. And you know what really brings this into focus, Nick, okay? First of all, it's, you can qualify for special rights in Canada and special benefits if you can demonstrate your Indigenous ancestry. So one wonders how many people out there are actually getting some of these benefits and special rights as a consequence of making false claims. But it brings into question this whole, brings into focus this whole area now of the more and more that we are using race and ethnicity in order to treat people differently, whether in law or whatever it is, that it really, you know, this has got to be, I hesitate to use the word epidemic, but it's got to be being used a whole lot more. I mean, there's so many angles on this, not the least of
Sure.
which is, how do you make a claim in public that your father is a Cree Indian when he's not?
Well,
And
like I
expect
said,
to
it
get
worked.
away with it. She expected to get away with it, Nick.
Well, a lot of
This
these
is a
people,
provincial court judge.
a lot of these people think they're of the elite, and then no one will ever question them, and they can say whatever they want. And let's face it, a lot of times people don't challenge this stuff, or if they do, it's meek and mild. And I'm looking at the prime minister squarely in the face at some of the things he's been accused of, some of the things he said. No one's ever called him on it. So you breed a culture. And that culture says, look, say whatever you want. No one, because what's that old line? Don't you judge me. That is the worst line I think I've ever heard, because we make judgments about people every single day. That's why we have this occupation called judges. They are there to do exactly that. We pass judgment on who we're going to be friends with, what stores we're going to shop at, what clothing we're going to wear. There's a whole list of things we make judgments about every day. So this idea that we shouldn't judge because, oh, you how dare you judge me? Well, if you don't judge people, how are you going to have any kind of community standard? These people don't want standards applied to them. So I'm only guessing at this in this case, that she must have felt that, hey, I'm a Supreme Court judge, or not Supreme Court, provincial court judge. Nobody's going to bother me. I can say what I want. I'll get away with it. Trudeau does. This one does. That one does. The mayor does. And it's because we don't punish people at the ballot box. They build on this sense of entitlement. And my classic example is Dalton McGuinty. I will not raise your taxes, but I won't cut them either. What's the very first thing he did? He canceled the law that said he couldn't cut taxes, and then he went and he cut taxes. He broke his promise, and people elected him again.
Sorry, raise taxes, Nick. Raise taxes.
Did I say lower? I wish.
Yeah, you said cut taxes. You're like, no, he raised taxes.
Yes, did he ever? But my point,
And he didn't just. By the way, he didn't just promise that
he wrote it down
wasn't going
and
to raise
signed
taxes.
it.
He had it. There was like a signing ceremony.
I know. Like, oh my God. But people let him get away with it. And that's what you want to talk about, a topic that will drive me out of my mind. That's it. You complain about politicians who cheat, lie, steal, rob, take candy from babies, whatever term you want to use, but you don't do a damn thing about it because you voted for them again. How can you complain if you keep voting for the very people that caused the problem in the first place?
Part of this, again, I hadn't thought of this until just now, but I recall now there was a story this week that the Métis Nation, or the Métis Council, whatever the governing Métis Council is across Canada,
Right.
has suspended the Métis Council of Ontario, because their claim now is that there are too many people who are Métis in Ontario, or claiming to be Métis, but can't actually prove it. So what they're saying now is that if in order to reinstate the Ontario chapter into the national organization,
Had to do a little
that
reading,
that
do they?
Ontario now has to readopt strict standards and demand that everybody who's a member of their particular of their nation, okay, that they demonstrate this through some sort of documented evidence.
You mean like they should have been doing all along?
I don't know. I mean, on that I disagree with Nick. Only because I'm more radical than you are on this. I don't think that there should be any difference between people based on their ethnicity or their religion, at least when it comes to government policy or law, their religion, their ancestry, or anything like that. I recognize that that's a complicated topic, because there are descendants of First Nations that were independent, sovereign nations, albeit differently structured in their polity than Western Europeans were at the time. but there were treaties that were signed and agreements that were made. And so it's become a real mishmash, a real confusing situation. But there is some argument in that case for different standards or different laws under certain circumstances. It's extremely complicated.
Well, let me
But
throw a caveat in there then. And that caveat would be when I said, like they should have been doing all along, if you're going to play this game, if you're going to go down this road, right, of allowing these perks and benefits for the First Nations of Canada, then you at least had better be able to prove you actually are one, is kind of what I meant by that.
right. And so I guess the big question for me would be whether or not this Turpel Lafond was actually appointed to the bench in Saskatchewan because of her alleged First Nations ancestry, and which again, would be, I think, it'd be a tragedy.
Well, how many good judges did you pass over in order to make that happen?
Okay, that's really all the time we have for tonight, Nick. I
An
really
hour show
enjoyed it.
was
It's
fine
good to have
already.
you. We haven't done our show for a while, so we're gonna have to make sure we get back onto that on Sunday evenings.
Yeah,
ladies
we'll
and
be back
gentlemen.
Sunday evening.
Okay. So I want to thank our guest tonight, my guest, Nick Vandergrat. A very entertaining and interesting show. And I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Check out the website, josephbenamy.com, without a hyphen, for podcasts of past episodes and recommended reading, interesting offers, etc. And while you're there, please make sure that you sign up for email updates. Okay, so that's it for this week, ladies and gentlemen. No, I shouldn't say this week. That's it for tonight. We'll catch you tomorrow night on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show.